Greetings, everyone. This is the fourth episode of the Spectrum Spotlight, and today's guest is Dr. Beardon. Dr. Beardon, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Not a lot to know. So my official title, I'm a senior lecturer in autism, specifically at Sheffield Hallam University at the Autism Centre there. I'm the course leader for a postgraduate certificate in autism that we run in conjunction with the National Autistic Society here in the UK. If anybody's interested, we do a remote option every October, so you're more than welcome to come and join us on our postgrad journey. I also teach on the Masters in Autism at Sheffield Hallam University. And yeah, there's not much else to tell. I've just finished my sixth book and I'm on to my seventh, which will be out next year.
Awesome. It's really awesome to hear. What made you want to write on autism?
I didn't. My first book was in 2016. I've been working in the autism field. Well, I first started working in the autism field as a volunteer aged 14. But my sort of so-called autism career started probably, let me think, mid-90s. And throughout all of that time, I always promised myself that I wouldn't write a book, simply because I thought by the time it gets published, I will have disagreed with half of what I've written, because I will have learned a bit more about autism. Because having been in the field for whatever, 30 years, every day I learn something new. So I was always quite a lot of trepidation in terms of thinking, well, I shouldn't really write a book. But I tend to do as I'm told. And a publisher contacted me and said, can you write a book for us? So I was like, oh, if you're telling me to do that, then yeah. So they asked me to write a book on autistic adults. And I think their brief was write something that the layperson can understand around the most difficult autism concepts you can think of. So that was my challenge. So all of the books that I've written, I've aimed to be as easy to read as possible, but also at the kind of what I believe to be the forefront of kind of autism thinking within society, I guess. Whether I'm right or not, or whether I've managed to do that or not, then, well, you guys can be the judge, the readers can be the judge, but that was what I've attempted to do.
Gotcha. A lot of parents have found your books really helpful. It's something I've noticed. They've sold quite well. Do you disagree with a lot of the stuff written in your previous books?
No.
No. Oh, okay. Very
Luckily.
nice.
There isn't really. It's a really important job, like it was interesting when I wrote the first book. I kind of forgot that anyone was going to read it. I was really enjoying writing it, and then I kind of forgotten that I'd written it, and then the publication date came out and I was like, oh my god, people are going to read this. And I was like, I wonder what I wrote, because I never really read what I've written. I write it. I do read it a bit, but not much. But the very first I think the very first sentence in the very first book is never believe anything you read about autism, which I think is quite a good way of starting a book that's written about autism. But I maintain that. I think so much of what is written about autism, what is spoken about autism, is nonsense. And I'm really, one of the reasons why, going back to your original question, actually, why did I end up writing these books and why do I keep writing them, is to try and counterbalance some of the nonsense that other people are writing about autism. I think it's an incredibly dangerous arena to write things that aren't appropriate or valid. And which is why some of my books, certainly some of the writing in some of my books, I think is that the message that I'm trying to get across is, as I say, to counterbalance some of the misnomers and myths and untruths that other people spout. Not that I would name any names, but you can't, not a day goes by that you hear the news or you read a newspaper article or you listen to a lecture or you go to training or you read something and you just think, that's just rubbish. What you shouldn't be telling parents this. You shouldn't be telling autistic people this. That's just simply not the case. So there's some extra rationales in terms of why I still keep writing a book a year.
Yeah, to fight against misconceptions. Do you feel a lot of the narratives around autism are really negative, portraying it as very negative thing?
Almost invariably. I mean, the diagnostic criteria themselves. So Western society tends to use, I know America's slightly different, but it's either DSM-5 or ICD-10 in terms of the actual, this is the criteria. You don't have to look any further than that in terms of negative, pejorative, I would go as far as say harmful narrative or language. It's there in black and white. So at the moment, and I fundamentally disagree with this, but at the moment, not in a sense allowed to be autistic unless you're problematic. I mean, that's essentially what the diagnostic criteria states. And I just think that's an extraordinary way to label a human being. It blows my mind. I genuinely think in, I don't know, X number of years, we'll look back on today's practice and just think, what were we doing? This is nuts. And it, I worry that it's moving away from the diagnostic criteria, but just in terms of the general narrative, if we say, right, you are an autistic person, by definition, that means you are disordered, you're impaired, you've got a problem, you've got persistent difficulties. The damage that can be done to that individual, whatever age they are, or whatever damage that can be done to that family, or telling that narrative to the parents, it really worries me. And I know human beings, I know adults, autistic adults, who are traumatized as a direct result of those sorts of narratives. So if we say, I love the American concept of microaggressions that developed in the 70s around Black Americans, and the damage that can be done by pejorative narrative around a particular culture, race, sector of humanity. And there's no way in a million years you'd get away with, in inverted commas, those sorts of microaggressions now when it comes to race, and yet we're still allowed, in inverted commas, to do it with autistic people, and it blows my mind. And those sorts of ongoing microaggressions, you are a lesser human being, which is essentially the narrative that is often espoused when it comes to autism. If you're faced with that as an autistic person on a day-to-day basis, no wonder you're going to end up with difficulties with your mental health and all of those sorts of things. I don't know what it's like for you, but I am of a generation where we were taught, if you parent an autistic child, then it's fully expected that you will go through a grieving process. So we're essentially telling parents, if that's still the case over your way, that is disgusting. We're essentially saying it's so bad, it's akin to your child being dead. That's just, it blows my mind that anybody ever is allowed to say that about a human being being born just because they're autistic. It's extraordinary. I'm not, if there's any parents out there or autistic people who really struggle in life, I'm not denying that you don't face struggles and that there aren't problems associated by being autistic in today's world. The problem is not with being autistic. The problem, in my view anyway, the problem is the fact that the world is not set up to suit your particular needs. And there's a big difference between the two. Going back to the analogy in terms of being black well, not necessarily back in the day, but if you are black living in a massively racist society, you're going to have problems. The problems aren't because you're black, the problems is a racist society. So if you change that environment and racism no longer exists, as a black person, you no longer have a problem. And I'm not saying it's as simplistic as that, but it comes back to what I put in almost all of my books. Autism in itself just means you're autistic. It's autism plus environment that equals outcome. And you can't change an autistic person, and nor should you want to. So if you want to change the outcome for any autistic person, we need to change the environment, not the individual.
Steve Silverman does tackle that narrative head on, the myth that having autism or having a child with autism like ruins a marriage, right? That it's one of the worst, like it's a marriage killer. He actually finds, and I remember this statistic very well, that in having a child with autism, the rate of divorce isn't that different from the rate of divorce with a kid that's neurotypical. So it's just not true, simply not true, that having a kid with autism is like a marriage killer. It's like your kid is dead, right? It's not true.
Yeah.
If anything, there's a lot that can come out very positively about having a kid with autism, because I think you get more involved, because then you have to start thinking about early intervention, and that means having to be there more for your kid, right? So like my mother getting me early intervention helped out a lot, and I got really connected with her when I was younger. My sister, who's also on the spectrum, getting early intervention helped out a lot. Cultivated the relationship between my mom and my sister. So yeah, I'm glad that's being tackled by people like you, because it's just not true. And I can imagine a lot of parents feeling really scared to have children because of
Yeah.
that. They
Oh,
don't want to have their marriage destroyed.
absolutely. I once I wrote a letter. It was in what's called it's called The Conversation, which is an academic platform for publishing articles, short pieces of work.
Hmm.
And I did a response to Donald Trump, who said that there was this disaster in America because there was a growing epidemic of autism. So I wrote a letter to Donald Trump saying this is what you need to know about autism. It's slightly tongue in cheek. Basically, there's no autism epidemic. That's a nonsense. There's no more autism around these days, really, generally speaking, compared to when, back in the day. That's just because we're getting better in terms of recognizing who is actually autistic. We're still a long way away from getting it right, but we're getting a little bit better. But also this concept that that's automatically a bad thing. Again, it goes back to exactly what you're saying. And I think that parents are concerned about their child having a label of autism because of these misconceptions that are bred within society. So if you're told, if you grow up learning that autism is a terrible affliction, and that is akin to severe intellectual impairment, and your child will never get married or do well educationally, or all of these absolute nonsensical myths, but which do abound within society, then of course you're going to be concerned if that's suggested to you in terms of your child. And then quite often what will happen is you'll resist that diagnostic process because you go, well, if I don't get the label, then my child won't be autistic. If your child's autistic, they're autistic, whether they end up with a label or not. You can't do anything about that. But actually, I'm the other way around. I think if you do have an autistic child, you need to know. 100% you need to know. And you also need to know what to believe and what not to believe to protect you and your child from that narrative. And the main thing, I think, in terms of knowledge is power. If you've got an autistic individual in your life, be you a parent, an autistic person yourself, with an autistic partner, you've got an autistic mum, you're working with an autistic kid in class, whatever it is, if you don't engage with that individual through their autism lens, then the risk of doing that individual harm goes up. So if you want to reduce risk of harm to that individual, you need to understand how autism impacts on that particular individual through a sensory perspective, communications perspective, sociality perspective, etc., etc., etc. And if you don't, then you increase risk of harm and then subsequent trauma to that child.
Yeah,
That's what I
yeah.
think.
No. I completely agree with you. What book do you think that of the books you've written, which one do you think has had the biggest impact on the autistic community?
You'd have to, oh gosh, I don't know. So Adults in Autism is written specifically for newly identified autistic adults. Autism in Childhood is written specifically for parents of newly identified children. So in that sense, whether they meet the target audience or not, I don't know, but that's who they're targeted at. And then the next two, I'm just looking up on my bookshelf to remind myself what I've read. The next two are all about anxiety, and anxiety in childhood tends to be the one that most people quote me. And they say that they learned, well, I learned a lot in terms of writing it because it revealed to me just how unsafe autistic kids are in everyday life. So being exposed to life where there's that drip of constant anxiety, and it had a massive impact on me talking to individuals around as the concept of autistic safety, which I've written more about in my latest, well, I think in my latest book, around how non-autistic people, or what I call the predominant neurotype, if you say to them, when was the last time you felt unsafe, they're able to tell you in terms of, oh yes, it was this specific incident, it was when I was crossing the street and there was a fight, or whatever it might be. And the reason they're able to identify a specific incident is because it doesn't happen very often. Whereas often you say to an autistic person, when do you feel unsafe, they're like, well, when I wake up, or when I leave the house, or when I go to school, or i.e. every day. And there's a huge disparity between, I'm not saying that non-autistic people can't feel unsafe in those situations either, but it's a massive difference between the autistic population, generally speaking, and the non-autistic population. And that's no way to live. That's it's essentially a basic human right to feel relatively safe most of the time. And autistic people don't, and that's related directly to anxiety. So the very high levels of anxiety that the autistic children suffer from as a direct result of very innocent, very obvious, just everyday life that they're exposed to. So just going to an ordinary school can be fraught with absolute terror for the autistic child. And We don't need to do that. I'm not saying autistic children shouldn't go to school. I'm saying they shouldn't have to live in high levels of anxiety throughout the whole of their childhood. That's just not on. So I really like, and then the subsequent anxiety in adults is all, sort of the corresponding one for grown-ups. And then I've done What Works for Autistic Children, and then I've just finished one, What Works for Autistic Adults. It's not published yet. That's only 3 chapters long. I like everything in 3. So if you notice all of my books, all of the chapters are in multiples of 3. So I did 9, 12. I think I've 2 15s and an 18. So this one is 3. God knows what the next one's going to be. Maybe 27, because I like 3 cubed as well. So maybe we'll have to do 27 chapters. Anyway, so yeah, What Works for Autistic Adults is really the middle chapter is a critique of the diagnostic criteria. The first chapter is about my golden equation, autism plus environment equals outcome. I'm trying to work out exactly what environment actually means. And then the third chapter is some other bits and bobs, including stuff around autistic safety. So I think in roundabout way, in answer to your question, I think it's anxiety in children that probably has the most impact, and probably rightly so, but I don't know.
Gotcha. In terms of selling numbers, I think it may be, or not selling numbers, sorry, review numbers. I think it may also be like another contender is also Autism in Childhood.
Okay,
That one
I
has a
have
lot of
no
reviews.
idea. Yeah,
Oh,
you
that's all
sound
on
like
Amazon.
you sound like you know a lot more about my books than I do, which wouldn't surprise me at all. So yeah, no, and obviously they're dated, so some have been around longer. At least 2 of them, the first 2 are in their 2nd or 3rd edition, and then there's translations as well. So I know some of them are available in audio. So I narrated 2 of them. And I keep asking my publisher if I can narrate the others, because I get quite a lot of requests from autistic people saying I find it very difficult to process the written word, but I really enjoy the audio versions. And then some have been translated into Japanese and Spanish and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess that probably has an impact as well on things like review numbers and what have you.
Oh yeah. Take translations as something really big, because if translations are happening, that means it's not just impacting in like English speaking countries. It's all over the place. It's really
Yeah.
cool. It's really awesome. So regarding your book, Autism in Childhood, because that's a book that got me like interested in your work, what do you think were the top 3 findings you found when researching your book?
Oh God, what a question. In autism in childhood. Well, I suppose the first is just the level of ignorance that is then given to parents. So that was one thing. So even things like, I mean, it blows me away. Again, I don't know what it's like over in the States, but there in some areas here in the UK, you're not allowed to go on the diagnostic pathway until you've done a parenting course. So it's like you're going back to like, you've created this terrible child through your bad parenting, and we've got to tick that box before we even go down the autism pathway, which just is
Oh,
incredibly bizarre. Or, which I think is even worse, when you do get the diagnosis for your child, you're then sent on a parenting course, as if that's going to help as well. Again, just extraordinary. So I think that the level of ignorance that parents have to face. We ought to have a look to see what the chapters are. Yeah, frequently asked questions. I've put some stuff about myths. Actually, one of the things, and I'm well, I've got an academic title. I'm a senior lecturer in autism. But I worry about autism theory, for example. So the 3 main theories, which presumably a lot of conceptions around autism come from, so theory of mind, executive functioning, and central coherence, none of them meet criteria for what some people would put forward as good autism theory criteria. So if you say, okay, well, so the 3, that's a couple of guys called Regendron and Mitchell who wrote a paper in 2007 around what makes good autism theory. And so they said uniqueness. So is it only pertaining to the autistic population? Universality, does it relate to all autistic people? And specificity, so is it domain specific, or is there something else involved? None of those 3 big theories meet any of those criteria. And so then you sort of think, well, why are we still talking about these autism theories as if they're valid then? It's or as valid as they are perpetuated. They are only theories. And yet it seems to me that there's a direct link between some of those theories and then the definitions that there are out there of being autistic, which seems to me, again, fundamentally flawed. It's quite worrying. So I would put, I don't know, there is a section on autism theory in that, but again, just say to parents, look, if people say, oh, if your child's autistic, it means they lack theory of mind, so they won't have empathy, you can go back and question that. Say, well, actually, there is evidence to suggest that some children are hyper empathizers. And actually, I came up with my own theory called cross-neurological theory of mind. So saying, well, okay, well, there's difficulties in neurotypes, understanding neurotypes that are not of their ilk. So if you've got the predominant neurotype and then the autistic neurotype, then there will be problems with intuitively understanding each other. That doesn't mean, say, autistic people lack empathy. And actually, and it goes back, it's similar to Damien Milton's double empathy problem, who very, very clearly states that the non-autistic population lack an autistic understanding way more than the autistic population understanding the non-autistic population. So there are, as soon as you dig a little bit deeper into what people are saying about autism, that's why I like my first sentence, never believe anything you read about autism. You realize just how shaky the whole thing is, which again leads me on to thinking you need to be really careful who you listen to.
Mm-hmm. I have many friends on the autism spectrum who say that they don't, what they think is that it's not that they have an empathy problem, it's like mustering the words in response to tragedies or bad news, that they don't know what words to respond with that comes off as sympathetic, or words that convey accurately how they feel. So oftentimes they'll keep it short. And that bothers my friends because they're like, I really care about this person. Like this tragedy, news hurts me. But my response makes it seem like I don't care that much. And it bothers
100%.
them.
I got told in no uncertain terms. It was a very specific situation, actually. Somebody had said, oh, somebody had died. And I immediately said, well, did you like them? So that was my response, which I thought was a perfectly reasonable thing. Because then, like, if they'd have said, oh, no, I hated them, it's like, oh, well, maybe this is cause for celebration then. If they'd be like, oh, no, my absolute best friend in the world, it'd be like, oh, in which case, is there anything I can do to help? I think it's still a perfectly logical thing to say, but my wife tells me I'm not allowed to say it anymore. And I think that's quite a caring response. But actually, if you recognize again that there are different typologies of communication, there's different types of sociality, and it just really frustrates me that just because autistic people are in the minority, they're then deemed wrong. So the difficulties in responding in what I think your friends are saying is they're not responding in a non-autistic way. So they're responding in a perfectly acceptable autistic way, but if they're being judged not as autistic individuals, but as non-autistic individuals, that's when they fail. And of course, autistic people are going to fail at being non-autistic people because they're not autistic people. It's like my cat is a massive failure at being a dog. That doesn't make my cat a rubbish dog. It just means my cat is a cat, and I'm the one wrong if I'm judging my cat against being dog-like. That would be ridiculous. But unfortunately, autistic people seem to get judged day in, day out against this so-called norm, which is apparently preferable. And I don't think that's fair at all. In fact, it isn't fair. It's fundamentally unfair and I think unethical as well. So again, it's that example you gave is a brilliant example of where there's so many different layers that end up with the autistic person being the one feeling bad or being told that they're in the wrong or being judged incorrectly. Whereas actually it's a perfectly reasonable reaction. It's like, okay, well, I haven't necessarily got the words to convey my sympathy in the way that you have it, but that doesn't mean to say I'm any less caring. Maybe you need to understand that my way of being is just as caring. I wrote a bit in I can't remember which book, but and it sort of made me cry. And it's a bit about the thoughts of an autistic parent, sorry, of an autistic daughter, and then the thoughts of the autistic daughter. And the mum is sort of saying, I don't understand why my daughter doesn't love me. She never hugs me. She doesn't show affection. And then the daughter, her sort of inner sort of communication is, I don't understand why my mum doesn't realize that I love her more than anything in the world. And when I go and stand next to her, that close to her, which I would never do with anybody else ever, I'm demonstrating the most affection I could ever demonstrate to a human being. And I think it still makes me cry just thinking about those two narratives, and just a total mismatch in terms of communication, and neither individual really is in the wrong, and certainly the child is not in the wrong just because she displays affection in a different way compared to anybody else.
Yeah, mustering those words in response to tragedy, or to show love, can sometimes be a little difficult. And sometimes less words are better if you want to convey how you truly feel. Like sometimes in response to a tragedy, maybe saying less is better. Give the person some space.
It's one of the problems, isn't it? Because there's no rules and regulations about it. There
Yeah.
has to be, so it's presumably, there are presumably almost an infinite number of different factors depending on the situation. So there's no right or wrong answer. And the other thing I think that a lot of, I don't know if this is your experience or your friend's experience, is that just that sort of sensory stroke emotional overwhelm, where you're so empathic and you're so upset on behalf of the other individual that it's impossible to get anything out because it's just total overwhelm. It's like, right, that's me done. And that can then come across as being indifferent or not
Mm,
caring, whereas actually it's completely the opposite, totally the opposite. And of course, then even just being with people takes up a lot of energy and effort. And if all your energy and effort is being taken up by just being with that individual or in that social situation, then it lowers your cognitive ability. So your actual ability to think clearly is less because your energy is being taken up elsewhere. So then when you go home, you think of all the most brilliant things to have said in that occasion, but by then
mm,
it's too
mm.
late. And again, that's behind closed doors and people don't realize the real you, if you like.
Yeah, yeah, I get that. I get that. Which is like why I don't, with my autistic friends, I don't really get offended if they keep it short, because I totally understand where they're coming from. Totally understand where they're coming from. Everyone has a different way of communicating their feelings. Um, what do you think every parent with a child on the autism spectrum should know? You've written a lot on parenting and autism, so I'm curious what you think every parent should know.
That there's
Just parent with
absolutely,
autism, child with
yeah,
autism.
there's no point comparing their autistic child either with a non-autistic child or with another autistic child. They're their own autistic individual in their own autistic right, and to develop their own authentic authenticity and allowing them to understand themselves. I think the most powerful thing probably you can ever do as an autistic individual is to learn to have as good an understanding of self as possible, or as a parent of an autistic child, to allow that autistic child to have its best understanding of their own authentic autistic self themselves, gives you the armor to make decisions that are less likely to cause you harm. So I think a lot of autistic people make decisions based on what other people think, which are not based on their autistic
Hmm.
authenticity. So those decisions are wrong, or they do the individual harm, and they make the same mistakes over and over and over again. Whereas then it's like, okay, well, I discover I'm autistic, I change my entire frame of reference in terms of how I make decisions, and all of a sudden I'm making decisions that are actually better for myself. And I think parents need to embrace that, love the fact that their child is autistic, just in the same way they would love their child just for being their child, and really engage with it, understand it, and uh, always journey towards having that better understanding of seeing life through your own child's autistic individual lens. And when you do that, things become so much clearer. And again, it takes a lot of bravery. It takes a massive amount of bravery being a parent of an autistic child, because here's one for you. Actually, this is probably a much more succinct answer. If you're going to parent an autistic child, if you do things that work well for everybody else, you're probably not doing it right for your autistic child. You need to be parenting in a different way by definition, because your child is not the same as everybody else. So you sometimes have to fight for that. You have to fight against the system. You have to fight for different ways of communicating, or different ways of having a sensory environment, different ways of educating, all of those sorts of things. So I think that's really important. Being there, being the guard for your child until they're at such a stage where they can, be their own guard, is essential in terms of your
Hmm.
child's well-being. Absolutely.
Yes, I agree. I agree. Was the last book you wrote Autism in Adults?
So I've finished it's called What Works for Autistic Adults. So I've finished writing that, and that's being published later on this year. And I've also already just signed a contract actually last week for my next book, which is called something like, well, it's a working title. So you'll be the first person in the world, actually, outside my publishers, something around what's reasonable about being autistic. So it's all about what constitutes reasonable adjustments in the world. So what the world should be doing to make reasonable adjustments to accommodate the needs of autistic people. So it'll be a much bigger book, I suspect, than most of my others. So I've already written a chapter, say, for example, on what makes an autism-friendly eating out experience, what makes an autism-friendly university experience. So sorts of things that people might want to think about in terms of going, actually, it doesn't cost much, maybe it doesn't cost anything at all, to adjust the way in which we engage to make life more towards what I call an autopia, an autistic utopia, which is my vision for the future.
Gotcha. You've written a book, you've written not just on autistic children, but autistic adults. You wrote a book, of course, called Autism and Adults. What made you want to go from children to writing on autistic adults?
Well, I wrote the adults one first, actually, and then went
Oh, okay.
backwards. Yeah, and the absolute honest answer is because that's the book that the publishers told me they wanted me to write. And when they liked that and it seemed to sell quite well, they came back and said, "Will you write one for children or for parents of newly identified children?" But other reason would certainly include that. And well, actually, this is a trigger warning in a sense. Autistic adults don't live as long as they should. Some do, but many don't. And that's just statistics. We know that. But generally speaking, you're an adult a lot longer than you are a child. So you still need to get things right as an adult, especially for what we know is increasing numbers of late identified adults. So there's an increasing number, certainly in the UK, of adults, particularly women, but not exclusively, being diagnosed what we would regard as late, so in their 30s, 40s, 50s,
Oh yeah.
80s. I came across a couple of weeks ago a woman in her 80s, and you're never too old to get an identification, and you're
That
never
is
too
true.
old to genuinely learn something about yourself. So I think an autism identification, if you are autistic, is really super important. And again, a basic human right, really, I think. So yeah, I love writing, and I know, so I mean, my life is full of autistic adults, be they whoever, my students, whoever. I'm in contact probably every single day with autistic adults. So yeah, I love immersing myself in their world and learning from them on a day-to-day basis. And if I can give back in any way, then I'll do my best to do so.
Oh, you've given back plenty. You've helped out a lot with your books. You've sold really well, and they've helped fight misconceptions a lot. So as an autistic person, I thank you for it. Um, let's see. So yeah, with adults, it is important to have a book for them ready because I've had in our group and our in-person, well, not just our in-person groups, but our group discussions that we have, our group mentoring sessions. We've had adults that join and they're 30 plus years old, as old as 50, that discover they have autism, and even though they can't really get an early intervention anymore, they can get interventions, but not early intervention. They still say the diagnosis helps provide closure. Like, okay, now I know who I am, right? I know there's nothing wrong with me, and their confidence goes up because then they begin to think, or they think earlier in their life, oh, like, oh, the reason why I'm struggling making friends is because I have a character deficit. It's like there's something wrong with me. And the diagnosis helps provide closure, like, okay, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm just different. Mhm.
Yeah, totally agree. It's that permission to be who you always were. And there's a reason behind it. And for some people, it can be absolutely just an epiphany, a massive relief. Sometimes with elements of, well, why didn't anybody tell me earlier? Because actually my life, I might have gone down all sorts of different pathways, but also just that going back to that understanding of self, that realization that there is a reason behind some of the problems you might have faced, or actually in hindsight, they're not problems at all. They were problems for other people. They shouldn't have been a problem for me or whoever it is. So I love it. I don't think anybody should ever be denied that identification as an adult. And it really frustrates me when people say, "Oh, why do you want to bother? It's just a label or whatever." It's not. It's an individual identity, which is more than just a label. It's super important. Sometimes for the individual, the most important thing in their lives. Um, and then when people realize, for example, that they've been masking all their lives and that's why that's why they suffer from chronic fatigue or whatever, then as you say, they can actually potentially do something about it, which is amazing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The diagnosis helps out a lot with boosting confidence. You've written a number of books on autism. Which one did you say you enjoyed most writing?
Um, oh, that's an amazing question. Well, I did write one in 9 days, and as I like things in threes, I quite enjoyed that. Um, uh, do you know what? I've enjoyed writing all of the ones that I've written on my own, but what I've really enjoyed before then, I've co-edited books collating experiences from autistic adults and autistic parents of autistic children, and those collaborations with other autistic people, and specifically getting the narratives of autistic adults, that was an absolute honor, an absolute privilege, and I really really enjoyed that. So I wouldn't pinpoint any specific one of my. I love talking about autism. I love writing about it. So it's not a chore or anything like that. Sometimes it's hard going. It's quite emotional, you know, when you sort of think, you realize just how difficult life can be for some individuals, but then that sort of spurs you on to think, well, that's why it needs writing about. So it can be to a certain degree quite cathartic as well. But yeah, reading about the kind of auto ethnographic experiences and narratives of other autistic adults, that was always an absolute pleasure.
Gotcha, gotcha. That's awesome. Two more questions. What do you think the greatest issue that autistic adults face nowadays? What do you think is the greatest issue they face?
People making the assumption they know something about you just because of the diagnostic label
Yes, yes.
drives me mad. You don't
It
get it
makes
with
me
any other.
crazy.
Yeah, it's like, oh, you're autistic, therefore X, Y, and Z. It's just absolute. In fact, if there was any message I would get across to everybody else is, if never assume anything about somebody being autistic. You literally make no assumptions whatsoever, because it's a really, really. I was going to swear then. It's a really odd, totally illogical, nonsensical thing to do.
Hmm. I was once suggested by someone I respect a lot, and it's water under the bridge at this point, but there's something I said that I guess wasn't appropriate. I didn't realize it wasn't appropriate. And in response, they told me, okay, so one of the symptoms of autism is so and so. And I went from a 0 to a 10 really quickly. It just made me so furious.
Yeah.
Yeah, it drives me crazy. All right, so we have less than a minute left here on the Zoom meeting. So one last question. Are you optimistic about the future for autistic adults and children?
I'm an eternal optimist anyway. I figured it out once that approximately every 6 months I wake up in the morning and think, that's it, I'm quitting. And then by lunchtime I've got back on the horse. So now and again, because it sometimes it does get you down, and you think we're still talking about the same things that we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. But then you think, no, we are moving in the right direction. And one day we will get to utopia.
I agree. I agree. I'm optimistic as well. Well, Dr. Bearden, I hope I've been pronouncing your last name right.
Yeah,
Bearden,
no, it's
Bearden?
cool.
Okay. Thanks so much for being with us, but
No
we have to
worries.
end the
Thank
meeting
you
soon.
for chatting.
Of course, of course. Take care.
Cheers now. Bye.
Bye.